Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and other public television stations, the Mobile Corporation, John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, Laurel Foundation, Sunstrand Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line.
If he had lived, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be 100 years old, and during this centennial year, many publications and institutions have assessed the career of the most spectacular president of the century and the only one to be elected 4 times to the presidency. Among the men whose admiration for Roosevelt is very nearly unqualified is Edward Fetwell Prichard, Jr. of Kentucky, who at the age of 30 suddenly found himself in almost daily contact with President Roosevelt, indeed as a member, even at so young an age, of the Evanescing Brain Trust. In those years, 1940 and 41, Joseph Rao, longtime Democratic power and one of the founders of Americans for Democratic Action, has written, "Washington was a very exciting place, full of the brightest, most vibrant minds, and we all felt then that of all of them, the 2 men most likely to succeed to become President of the United States were Philip Graham and Ed Prichard. In the case of Philip Graham, as we all know, he was overcome by disease. Edward Prichard went to jail for 5 months for stuffing a ballot box. In doing so, Mr. Prichard confounded what seemed to be the entire world of intellectuals, politicians, diplomats, and lawyers who knew him and his career, his brilliant record at Princeton, his leading position at the Harvard Law School, from which he went to Washington to clerk for Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. They were the Washington jobs that brought him into the White House, then a spell in the Army from which he received a medical discharge. In 1949, Edward Prichard had his Watergate, and it was many years before he recovered his morale, but all Kentucky and much of Washington remembers him as, in the words of Mrs. Graham, publisher of the Washington Post, quotes, the most impressive young man of our generation, the one who dazzled us most. Mr. Prichard's health has failed him due to the diabetes that has nearly blinded a man who routinely used to read a book every day. The question today is, what is the legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Our examiner will be Mr. Al Smith, chairman of Al Smith Communications Group, about whom more in due course. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Prichard whether he sympathized with the constitutional amendment that barred more than 2 terms.
No, I don't think I did. I never felt that it was the major watershed of our constitutional life, but I had always felt that if people wanted to elect a president for 3 terms, that should be their prerogative. I know arguments as to why they shouldn't, and I know arguments as to why, arguments that are worthy of attention as to why, in Mr. Roosevelt's case, the 4th term particularly might have been risky. His health was probably not robust, to say the least. But in general, I think it's better to trust the people to make those decisions.
Of course, there was a famous Harvard sociologist who wrote a book in 1955 in which he said that if the American people could individually vote on the individual items included in the Bill of Rights, they'd probably vote against them. So isn't the purpose of the Constitution to guard against plebiscitary spasms?
I think that's, I think that the purpose of the Constitution is, in some respects, to guard against what you so colorfully call plebiscitary spasms. But all plebiscitary spasms are not born free and equal. a, a plebiscitary spasm that assailed the Bill of Rights, I should regard as extremely serious. But I don't think that the re-election of a chief executive can necessarily be categorized as a plebiscitary spasm, because there were very good reasons for re-electing Mr. Roosevelt to a third term, and indeed, it seems to me that was a very wise choice. And in the fourth term, it was sort of inevitable. But no, I don't think the re-election of senators, presidents, members of Congress is to be characterized as a plebiscitary spasm. Sometimes they outlive their usefulness, but that's a risk we run.
Well, it might indeed have been a gesture in retroactive vindictiveness, as it was called by some of its critics at the time. On the other hand, some people who backed it said that the clear collusion between Mr. Roosevelt, his backers, and his doctors, who persuaded the American people that he was in good health when he was palpably a dying man, was the kind of dissimulation against which this amendment seeks to protect you. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be a dying man while running for the second term, or for that matter, while running for the first term.
That is right, and it's happened. I mean, I don't know whether it's happened to a particular president, but that's right. And I think that, I'm not sure that we weren't better off to have Mr. Roosevelt dead and Mr. Truman president than we would have been to have Mr. Dewey president. But that's arguable, and I don't want that to be the main subject of our discourse this evening.
Yeah.
But
well, I'm sure
there was collusion in a sense, and I must say that it impressed itself upon me twice during the campaign, and I had I was not in privity with any of the medical records or medical opinions, but when he spoke to the Foreign Policy Association in New York, after that long parade through the rain, all through the city before millions of people, and his speech began to thicken, I was very apprehensive. That's the first time it came home to me that his health might be really impaired. And then on his inauguration day in 1945, he looked like a dying man. There's no question about that. But
might it be fair to say, in not intending to say it invidiously, that both you and Joseph Stalin would have had reason to be apprehensive?
Well, yes.
Because it's unlikely that Mr. Truman would have yielded at Yalta what, in fact, Franklin Roosevelt did, right?
Well, I don't know. I don't know who would have yielded what at Yalta. I think that...
well, you know what you would have done if you'd been president.
No,
so I thought you were prescient.
I don't even know that. And I'm
Well,
not sure Dewey knew it.
Well, did Franklin Roosevelt know when he ran for president against Hoover and said about him that he was guilty of reckless and extravagant spending? Did FDR know what he was going to do?
No, no. He was a complete, experimentalist. Certainly in the beginning of his administration, he ran in 1932 on a very orthodox, rather conservative platform in some ways. He always had a sort of a foot in each camp, in the sense that he had certain relationships with the historic progressive movement, but many ways. The Democratic platform in 1932 called for a budget annually balanced, an annually balanced budget.
And they were right.
Oh, of course, they were insane. They were insane. They were insane. You can't balance a budget during a recession or a depression without pushing the economy over the brink. But nevertheless, that's what it called for. And then the president said he was going to cut expenditures 25%. And when he got in, he started out doing that. He had this so-called economy bill, which reduced government pensions for veterans. And, of course, that created a political storm eventually, but then he changed course, and I think he correctly changed course. I think if he'd followed what he started out to do, it would have been an incorrect set of policies.
Well, when you ask yourself the question, Mr. Prichard, what is the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt, you are, as I understand it, you're required to ask yourself what is the legacy as it consolidated after he was elected president.
Right.
And that legacy certainly included an attempt to suborn the Supreme Court. It attempted a purge of the Senate.
Right.
But these are mere peccadillos, I take it, by your accounting.
Peccadillos? You take it any way you want to. If you want to ask me whether I think they were peccadillos or something else, I'll tell you. But don't put the words in my mouth, Mr. Buckley.
Yeah. Well, I certainly welcome enthusiastically any correction.
Well, now you want me to tell you what I thought about
yes, sir.
the court plan? Well, let me start first with the purge of the Senate. That, I think, was a great tactical error politically. But I see nothing in the world wrong with the president trying to get rid of members of the Congress that don't support his policies. That's what politics is all about. And I don't blame Mr. Reagan for doing the same thing.
Where is he trying that?
Well, I imagine
I can't think of any Republican he hasn't come out for.
No, well, what does it make whether Republicans or Democrats?
But I say, you implied that Mr. Reagan was trying to do the same thing.
No. What I meant is people who don't support his policies. Most Republicans have supported his policies.
Yeah, we were talking about Democrats.
What difference does that make? What difference does that make? A Democrat who is not supporting the policies of the leader of the Democratic Party may be just as much a fly in his ointment or a thorn in his flesh as a Republican. And in fact, Mr. Roosevelt caused a lot of people to shift lines. I mean, he picked up people like Senator Norris, Senator La Follette, and others, Governor Pinchot, who had long records in the Republican Party. So I think he certainly was justified if he felt that senators were opposing his policies and asking the Democrats in those states to nominate different people with different philosophies for the Senate. But the problem was it was a foolish effort because he didn't have the guns to get it done, and he was beginning to lose some of his political magic by that time because of the court packing plan and because of the recession, which his still persistent conservatism had precipitated in 1937, when in the face still of large unemployment and unutilized resources, he was persuaded to try to clamp down on the Keynesian fiscal policies and balance the budget prematurely. But now the court packing plan, I think, was a real, much more difficult issue. I think, in retrospect, I must say, as a young law student, I supported it. And I must say that I think I was totally wrong. But I think that, he was vexed by a court that was, in my judgment, making the wrong decision.
Do you think the NRA should be constitutional?
NRA as such? No,
Yeah.
no.
So the court didn't make a wrong decision in that case?
Oh, I don't think so. I think the wrong decisions they made were in the decisions involving the AAA, the Guffey Coal Act, the minimum wage laws, a great many others that were. No, the NRA, I think, was as one of the opinions said, was delegation of power run riot. Mm-hmm. And I think the NRA was largely a failure.
Well, Mr. Roosevelt called it, quotes, the most important and far-reaching legislation ever enacted by any American Congress.
Typical puffery of anybody. I mean, I can go through, you and I have played that game many times, Mr. Buckley. We can go through and fill our clipboards with little quotations from presidents that sound silly, and they do, because presidents can be silly, even the greatest ones.
Well, that I guess is my point. Not so much that Mr. Roosevelt was silly, but that about Mr. Roosevelt that caused him to be so exciting is not a part of the evolution of the American government that I happen to welcome.
I understand that.
There is what one might say the Jeffersonian direction, and the autocratic direction.
Well.
And I think the latter is the one that he took, oddly enough, backed by people who understood themselves as having liberal background.
Well, that's a way of putting it. I think that, one can talk about what is the Jeffersonian direction and what is the Hamiltonian direction. I think in many respects, both of our parties have had fissions and divisions, and there are Jeffersonian elements in both and Hamiltonian elements in both, and in our society, as it changes, there are both Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian elements, and there are those who think that sometimes we use Hamiltonian means to achieve Jeffersonian ends, and all those things. But Mr. Roosevelt, whatever he was, he believed in a strong national government. If that's what you regard as a plebiscitary insanity or whatever it is, he believed in a strong national government, as did Theodore Roosevelt, as did Abraham Lincoln.
Well, at one point in his career, he believed in dominating the Supreme Court.
Right.
In another, in dominating the party to the extent of purging people who disagreed with him. He had rather unpleasant personal habits, as, for instance, tapping the telephone of John L. Lewis, tapping the telephone of Donald, of the head of the War Production Board. He had a habit of calling people who disagreed with him pro-Nazi and kind of pro-fascist. So it seems to me that there is a part of that legacy which we ought not to forget, precisely because it keeps reminding us that the stronger the governor, the more tempted he tends to be, as Harold Acton warned us, by the temptations of power and the usufructs of office.
That's right, and Acton had a third line in there, that all power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are seldom good men, and I think that is true, true, true. And I think that you're going to find moral complexities, moral ambiguities, antinomies in the greatest of political leaders. And I would be the last to say that Mr. Roosevelt didn't, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. I don't deny it for a minute and don't think it exempts Mr. Roosevelt or anybody else. And I think part of the things you're talking about are part of the legacy. But I think there's a better and greater legacy. And I would call it what Joe Alsop, I think, very effectively dealt with in his centennial memoir, which I'm sure you regard as also a plebiscitary heresy. But at any rate,
Alsop has never done anything plebiscitarian in his
no,
life.
that's right. I was going to say, I'm glad you feel that way, because wouldn't he resent that?
He sure would, yeah.
Wouldn't he resent that? Oh my, Joe would resent it so much. But he spoke of the legacy as being one of inclusion. He did bring millions of people in this country who had hitherto felt somewhat excluded and put down and left out, that they belong. And I think perhaps that is the greatest and most positive element of his legacy. There are plenty of others that I would be delighted to talk about, but I'd also have to say we must take account of these, as you call them, unpleasant habits.
I am genuinely interested in your position. I'm not here merely as an antagonist.
I know.
And I have heard it said that he caused people to feel that they belonged, but in whatever reading I've done in American history, this tends to rather surprise me. For instance, the unity of the United States before, at the time we entered into the First World War, was really quite extraordinary. Nothing like the disunity that preceded our entry into the Second World War, so that I would have thought that although there had been a tremendous wave of recent immigration between the period of the Civil War and the turn of the century, America was in every sense of the word a solid state. The great separationist mania of the Civil War had been defeated. Now, what is it that caused this sense of demoralization that Dr. Roosevelt was needed to cure?
Are you talking about in 32 or,
yes,
or just
yes, sir.
before World War II?
Yes, sir.
Well, I think the long depression that had come before 1932, going back before 1929 in the agricultural areas of the country. We'd had a depression since the middle of the 20s, really almost since the end of World War I. Unemployment in certain sectors of the economy had preceded the stock market crash, and there was a feeling. We had 25% unemployment. We had all these bank failures. We had the financial system collapsing. I think people who had hitherto felt they belonged began to feel dispossessed, Steve.
Well, Mr. Prichard, I think this is true, that by the time Roosevelt was elected, people felt that the government didn't know how to handle the economy. I don't, however, think that this was a legacy that suggested any sense of corporate alienation, because the decade of the 20s was one from which the American people profited hugely. Productivity was up 40%. The individual distribution of income was up 25%. Even if we...
Individual distribution of income?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, you mean the per capita income?
Per capita, yeah. If what you're saying is that the people felt that we were out of control economically, I think there's no question that you're correct. But they simply went to Roosevelt not because they sensed in him some charismatic dominion over economic affairs, as witness that he became elected when he criticized Hoover for going too far left.
Oh, yes. I think they elected him because he wasn't Hoover. Just as I think they elected Mr. Reagan in large measure because he wasn't Carter. But I'm talking about the legacy of Roosevelt. I'm not talking about why he got elected. Those are two entirely different things, I think, as you already.
But I'm asking you, what caused the alienation if it wasn't merely that 2.5 years of bad economic news?
Well, there were groups, let's take, for instance, the blacks, and some of the immigrant groups had felt that even though the country prospered, they still felt that they were not really a part of the system.
But part of FDR's coalition was with the Jim Crow South.
Oh, it was very full of all the inconsistencies that all political alliances are. On the one hand, it was...
You make things very hard for me. You agree with everything I say.
Well, of course.
And arrive at contradictory conclusions.
Exactly. That's what I mean to do. I mean, because much of what you say is true. It's the significance of it that raises questions with me. I think that obviously Mr. Roosevelt's early coalition was a coalition of the farmers, farm people in the West, the city bosses in the East and North, the Southern bourbon leaders in the Senate and the House, the labor movement and the blacks. Sir?
And the intellectuals.
And the intellectuals, who, yes, they came along. I don't know that they were in the head of the procession in the beginning, but they came along. In fact, they looked on him with contempt in 1932. Most of them were either feebly for him or for Norman Thomas, but those who didn't sign that absurd thing about, what was it, Browder and Ford. But nevertheless, that was a coalition, and it had in it inconsistencies and conflicts and complexities and ambiguities. But in general, the thrust of the New Deal and of the Roosevelt administration and the Roosevelt program was in the direction of upward movement for the blacks, even if only the symbolic attitudes of Mrs. Roosevelt.
He wouldn't even endorse the anti-lynching bill.
That is correct. That is correct. He didn't endorse the anti-lynching bill. He only created the Fair Employment Practices Commission after Philip Randolph led a march on Washington. But he did it. And the fact is, what he did at that time was feed them. The reason they went to him so strongly wasn't that he was the great champion of civil rights at that time, any more than Mr. Lincoln was. Mr. Lincoln was no champion of civil rights or desegregation. He just hated slavery. Now, in the case of Mr. Roosevelt, I think he was slow being a political animal, he was slow to come to those things and antagonize his southern flank. But I think the feeling of blacks was that they were improving under Roosevelt and that he was their friend. And that's why they left the Republican Party in droves and moved into the Roosevelt coalition. They were in many places like this very soil on which we sit. They were the core of the Republican Party when I was growing up in Kentucky.
Sure, the party that had historically liberated.
Party of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah. Well, in that case, what is it that Mr. Roosevelt did that, for instance, enhanced his prestige with the blacks, say, in Kentucky?
Well, put a lot of them on the WPA. That was probably fed them.
That didn't enhance the daughters of King Lear with their father.
That's right. But they weren't the daughters of King. If they had been in the royal court, they might have felt differently. They might have shown how sharper than the serpent's tooth. But in fact, they were drawn to him. And there was more than just the feeling that they were getting on WPA or getting a few groceries, although that's nothing to be sneezed at. But there was a feeling that they amounted to more, that they were rising in the world, and that they were commencing to belong, even though the measures that he advocated were inadequate, and he was slow and tortoise-like in it, and was, not willing to make the full commitments. But still, they felt he was headed in their direction, and I think he was.
Well, suppose his opponent in 1940 had been not Wendell Willkie, but Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, committed as he was when he ran for president in 1968 to 2 or 3 generations of civil rights reforms that were undreamed of by Roosevelt, would you have said that that would have caused a reversal in that slide of black sentiment towards the Democratic Party?
Well, if Nixon had a run when against Roosevelt?
If he had run in 1940. Are you saying that it's as simple as that which party identifies itself with the desires of a voting constituency that cause those loyalties?
I would say it's a question of which party gets there. What was it General Forrest said? Get there fastest with the mostest men. It's a question of which group, party, or leader gets on that issue first and somehow identifies himself with it in the eyes of those to whom it's important. Now, how he does it may vary depending on the situation. And by 1940, I don't know what the situation would have been at the time at Nixon. In 1940, Nixon was just out of law school and looking for some place to light. So I don't know just where he would have been in 1940.
Well, I made my point maladroitly, and I apologize. I'm saying, are we prepared to measure the Roosevelt legacy exclusively in terms of economic endearments?
No, I would say not. I don't think a feeling of inclusion that I was talking about, and that I think Joe Alsop was talking about.
Well, that's what I'm asking about.
It's just
to define that inclusion.
It's hard. It's just a feeling of belonging, a feeling of, and I must say that to some degree that feeling was forged in the war afterwards too.
During the Marion Anderson incident, for instance.
Things of that sort, which came up in the war, and also the great mixing of peoples and groups who were together in the service, and the blacks were pulled out of the South, and
the Army was segregated under Roosevelt.
It was segregated, but they went to places they'd never been before, which weren't segregated.
Like Iwo Jima?
Well, some places, France, England. I mean, it pulled them away from their rural roots, Mr. Buckley. Now, don't play games on things like Iwo Jima. I mean, You know as well as I do, and I'm not saying anything terribly original or significant, that the experience of World War II took a lot of people out of their somewhat restricted and provincial environments and moved them into a more sort of cosmopolitan milieu. And I don't, that's nothing in it. And I think that sort of completed a number of the things that had been coming during the Roosevelt period that pointed toward inclusiveness and our becoming more nearly one people in some ways. And you can certainly point to ways in which we weren't and all those things.
Well, may I try it, Mr. Prichard, may I try out an analysis on you and invite you to comment on it?
Sure.
Albert J. Nock once wrote that the decade of the 30s would go down in history as a decade in which people discovered in great numbers that they were political as distinguished from economic means of enhancing their condition, i.e., it didn't mean necessarily that you had to go out there and produce more corn. You could do it by voting for somebody who would vote you more money. Now, if he is correct, then that is a profound commentary on the vector of political democracy, and one whose direction was vastly accelerated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he came up with any number of programs precisely intending to satisfy these political appetites as substitutes for economic activity. Now, does that strike a responsive chord in you at all?
Not at all.
Well,
Wait a minute. May I explain why?
Of course.
May I explain why? Because I think that the notion that this society of ours operated on the principle that everybody was rewarded according to his productivity in a sort of atomized market system is far from a totally correct description of what we had preceding the New Deal. The Bank of the United States, the first protective tariff, the Homestead Act, the grants to the transcontinental railroads, the grants to the railroads, indeed, that came across this state that were built largely on the basis.
Without defending those were viewed as incentives, weren't they?
But that's it. One man's bribe is another man's incentive. That's that's the whole thing. I mean, you want to characterize one type of governmental assistance as in a pejorative sense, and another kind as an incentive.
Well, shouldn't we try intelligently to distinguish between the two?
I think so, and I would be glad to try to do that.
So therefore,
I think if a man's out of work and you give him a chance to take a pick and shovel on a WPA project and help build a schoolhouse or a road or a street, that's an incentive, and it's productive. It's not the ideal way to put people to work, but it beats not doing it. Now, in other cases, of course, if it's purely largesse for the relief of destitution, that's a question of need. It's not a question, the people on food stamps didn't vote themselves food stamps. They don't vote much. They don't have much political power. They are not the most articulate voting members of the community, but the people on food stamps were largely received food stamps because people who weren't on food stamps felt a bad conscience about it.
Well, you mean the farmers?
Oh, no, I don't think so. It really wasn't the original food stamp program, which was sort of incipient, was designed to deal with surplus commodities. But when the food stamp program burgeoned during the 60s and early 70s, reaching its apex during the Nixon administration, it really was a movement by people who felt that we ought to do more and could do more about hunger. The farmers weren't the driving edge of the later thing on food stamps.
May I suggest, Mr. Prichard, that as far as I'm concerned, you are confusing two categories. I would accede in the proposition that a government ought, at the margin, to use all of its powers to prevent people from starving to death. I'm sure that Herbert Hoover, who was prepared to feed all of Europe before permitting them to starve to death, 30 years before Roosevelt was a fact in American politics would not have disagreed with me. I am, however, asking whether the institutionalization of certain programs, which ought to have been viewed as emergency programs, isn't a part of the Roosevelt legacy, so that we are, in fact, now drowned in Washington with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of agencies whose primary motive is simply to satisfy the particular appetite of a particular potential constituent.
I think those are legitimate concerns, Mr. Buckley, but I don't believe that they are really of that great a danger and of that great a, it isn't the welfare programs and the food stamps that are running out of control today. It's these entitlement programs, and if we want to get on to that, and they are a legacy of Roosevelt too.
Yeah.
And I would agree that they create problems, but I think the concept of entitlements is really one of the finest legacies of the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration. And it's like all other legacies, if you expend it with too much profligacy, it can get your economy and your society in trouble. I don't believe that the thing is limitless, but the concept of entitlements, that there are certain benefits to which a citizen is at least arguably entitled as a person in the society, seems to me to be a bulwark against the tyranny of the all-powerful state and against the excesses of the corporate and capitalist sector, both. In other words, it has, as your friend Mr. Wills would say, a sort of Chestertonian, Bellockian overtone, which I think is good.
Well, it may be good. It certainly is not American traditionally. And may I remind you, Mr. Prichard, that the word entitlement hardly fits Social Security as devised by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because Social Security was a program which was not considered an entitlement. It was considered a repayment of funds that had previously been contributed by individual Americans and by their employers, number one. And point number two, it was considered as a fund to be made available to those who had no other resources, which is why it was conceived of as something that would be completely viable economically with a 1% annual contribution, and is now going broke with 13.5% annual contribution.
Oh, well, I think what you're saying is about has some merit to it, but the fact is that at the time as Social Security was started, that's right, we had, first place, there wasn't anybody going to draw it for years, because in the beginning you had to accumulate benefits to draw them, and you still do. But the point was that since the system was starting from square one, it took people a long time and long earnings, and since they've earned more. Now, it's true the tax has gone up because the benefits have gone up, and I think there's a limit to the extent to which the benefits can go up, and to the extent and for the extent to which our society can support them. But in both cases, there was an entitlement in this sense, whether it was the Roosevelt Social Security or Social Security as it's developed. There was the concept that you didn't have to go with your hat in hand and ask somebody for charity or for a means test or something of that sort, that it was an entitlement that the citizen had on reaching the age of retirement. Now, whether that entitlement has become too generous is another question, or whether it's becoming too generous.
But, Mr. Prichard, you missed my point, really, because there is no such entitlement for people who don't have Social Security. If you make no contributions, you don't qualify for Social Security.
That's right.
So it's not an entitlement in virtue of you being a human being.
Well, no.
It's an entitlement in virtue of you having participated in the Social Security system.
But one of the defects of the system is it isn't all-inclusive. And I think, like everything else, it's got its imperfections, and I think they ought to be corrected. I think it's a mistake that large numbers of federal employees are not in it.
Well, they have their own, and it's much sweeter.
It's much sweeter, but that's what's wrong with it. That's what's wrong with it. It's so sweet that it's going to, it's worse in the sense of eruption than the Social Security program.
At what point would you define my entitlement as limited by your entitlement? To the extent that I'm entitled to your income, you are required to make your income available to me. Now, at what point do I reasonably draw a line that protects you and your entitlements as an American worker, let's say, trying to send your children through school and paying your taxes and so on?
Oh, that's part of the ongoing art, the art of government, to try to draw those lines. Most issues finally become issues of more and less, of where you draw lines. It's like everything else. Where do you draw the line on the freedoms of the Bill of Rights? Where do you draw the line on the application of any right or entitlement or any policy? I think it's very difficult. I'm not trying to make it easy by saying that, but that's just a painful...
Well, didn't the 9th and 10th Amendment of the Constitution attempt to draw that line?
Well, the 9th and 10th Amendment came before
Roosevelt repealed those, to be sure.
No, I think the development of society repealed them. Roosevelt didn't repeal them. The Civil War repealed them to some extent. The 10th Amendment just said all the rights not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states or to the people. Mm-hmm. And that's true, but that still leaves you the question, what rights are given, what powers are delegated to the federal government, and that's been an expanding concept.
What article in the Constitution would you understand as the father of Social Security?
The power to lay and collect imposts, excises, and taxes for the general welfare, and spend money for the general welfare. I'm not using the words exactly in the legislative article of the Constitution.
Well, what did you understand the meaning of the framers in imposing the 10th Amendment if your understanding of the general welfare clause is so broad? Why'd they bother to put it in?
Well, because there were things at that time, purely the regulation of purely intrastate commerce, the regulation of many affairs which in the context of that time were purely local.
Well, as you know, under the New Deal, a court ruled that the Commerce Clause was invocable in governing the operations of an elevator in a single city in the Midwest. Because why? Well, you're a lawyer. You can make a fancy argument for that, right? Right. Somebody using that elevator is not engaging in interstate commerce, but maybe the guy who comes in is bringing eggs from the neighboring state or something.
The Supreme Court, long before the New Deal, expounded the doctrine that those activities in intrastate commerce, which had a substantial effect upon interstate commerce, were swept into the ambit of the federal commerce power. That's a doctrine written by Chief Justice Hughes back in the Minnesota rate cases, long before Franklin Roosevelt ever came to Washington.
Well, and I think it's obviously defensible. What I'm saying is that somewhere along the line, the 9th and 10th Amendments of the Constitution turned out to be invisible, and that invisibility was something that came about in part because of the omnivorous appetite of Franklin Delano Roosevelt to run everything. William Greene, the president of the AFL, protested against Roosevelt's CCC. He used language much harder than I would use. He said it smacks of fascism, of Hitlerism, of a form of Sovietism. But still, he is the head of the labor unions saying that the appetite of Mr. Roosevelt to run things was inordinate.
Well, Mr. Greene his son was a roommate of mine in law school, and his son's a delightful person. But Mr. Greene could say some very silly things. You know perfectly well that the CCC wasn't fascist, and if William Greene said that, William Greene was an ass, an idiot, as Mr. Bumble said about the law. Now, the CCC camps were one of the, I suppose, the least controversial aspects of the Roosevelt program. You're the first person I ever heard invoke a criticism of them in the last 40 years. I hear people around now, people with no particularly liberal tendencies saying, isn't it too bad that we can't have CCC camps so all these young boys could go out and have some work to do that are on the streets?
Yeah, what you're making difficult, Ms. Prichard, is the isolation of things we approve of and means by which we accomplish them. There are an awful lot of things that I'd like, for instance, for the state of Connecticut, which I see no obligation of the taxpayers of Kentucky to provide me with. And since our income in Connecticut is slightly above the national average, I don't see even that we have a mendicant's posture in coming to you for that help. So I don't see really why CCC was required for the people of New York, who in the first instance paid the taxes to pay CCC. This is the whole idea of federalism that tended, as I say, to become invisible with FDR.
Well, I think that's, I just disagree with you on that for the following reasons. The federal government doesn't tax states, it taxes people. And it
wasn't allowed to do that until about
1913.
That's right.
We used to have a governor of whom you've heard in this state named Happy Chandler. And when he'd run for governor, he'd always have a program. And the opponents would say, where do you intend to raise the money for this program? And Mr. Chandler's response always was, I'm going to get the money where the money is. And in a sense, the federal tax system, in its imperfect way, gets the money where the money is and spends it where the needs are, so that you're not taxing a state, you're taxing people of a certain economic level, no matter what state they live in, and providing for certain needs, no matter where they may be. But getting to federalism.
Happy Chandler and Willie Sutton had a lot in common.
Well, I don't know about that. If you mean that you think that taxation is robbery, I can't agree with you.
Well, so did John Marshall say that taxation at a certain level.
He said the power to tax involves the power to destroy,
right.
And who wouldn't?
Right.
Who couldn't? Who could disagree with that?
Roosevelt.
Every power involved. Well, no, he didn't. He didn't. We've had much higher taxes since Roosevelt left than we ever had before.
I don't think so.
Oh, yeah.
I think the surcharge in World War II is about as high as we ever got,
well,
91%.
Well, but we had it for a long time. And in peacetime, I'll say we've had taxes that were higher than he had in peacetime. Always wartime taxes are bound to be high. The trouble with them in World War II was they weren't high enough. I'd like to have a whole program with you on the economic management of World War II, which I think was a miracle.
How about next week, same time, same place?
That's right. That's good.
Mr. Prichard, with your permission, we'll submit the questions from Mr. Al Smith, who is chairman of the Al Smith Communications, a distinguished citizen of Kentucky, who is past chairman of the Kentucky Arts Commission, and of course has a career in as a journalist, former journalist. Mr. Smith.
Mr. Prichard, if the historians are more or less agreed that either consciously or unconsciously the Roosevelt administration's goals began to focus on, say, reviving the economy, redistributing the wealth, and getting themselves elected by reelected by realigning groups, to what extent do you think they succeeded in reviving the prosperity of the country? I noticed Mr. Buckley was either too kind or too sophisticated to suggest that the war, World War II, took care of the economy. He might have if we'd given him more time. But how much did the New Deal contribute to putting the economy back together?
I think it contributed some, but not enough. I think there were two things that must be said about the economic consequences of the New Deal. One is that we did reduce unemployment substantially. We did have a rather good recovery until 1937, when Mr. Roosevelt got another fit of conservatism and decided, though we still had a lot of unemployment and still had a lot of unused and idle resources, that we ought to put the brakes on and balance the budget. So his mistake in that respect precipitated a recession from which we had only just begun to recover again when the war came on. We began to recover in about 1938 or 9 from the 37 recession. And I think his trouble was that he didn't have faith enough to apply his Keynesian remedies in their fullness. And that's one thing. Then the second thing that I would say in what I hope is fairness is that Mr. Roosevelt never really seems to me in retrospect to have realized the importance, equal importance of capital investment and capital outlay with consumer confidence and consumer spending as twin generators of economic strength, and that perhaps in the course of his reforms he was rather inclined to excoriate those who, with a little more gentleness of touch, might have been stimulated into an investment boom that would have supplemented and not frustrated some of the measures of the New Deal. Now, those were its economic failures. It seems to me it was partially successful. It certainly improved things over what they were. It certainly taught us things which we could learn to our benefit in the future in managing the economy.
I believe I read that the Federal Reserve of that time in 36 or 37 was also trying to put the brakes on the money supply, Mr. Prichard.
That's correct.
Which suggests to me that you may be suggesting that as Roosevelt attempted to lean to the conservative side and to a traditional business view of the role of government and the economy, he experienced failures, and when he sort of soared out, swung out a little bit, he had some successes. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, almost. I think that's right. I think it was not so much that he veered to the side of business as that he veered to the side of fiscal orthodoxy. And he was persuaded that we were on the verge of a dangerous inflation, when in fact we had millions of people out of work and many factories still partially idle. And it's right, the Federal Reserve did clamp on the monetary brakes, and the fiscal policy was shifted towards balancing the budget, and I think he did it too soon. And I'll contrast that with the economic management during World War II. Now, I know this is a thing that I may feel a little personally involved in, because that's what I worked on a good part of the time when I was working in the White House. But in World War II, we financed the war, fought the war, we increased the civilian standard of living substantially in real terms, reduced unemployment per force. I'm not saying that that was some great achievement in itself, to really a frictional level, and at the same time had a total inflation during that period of less than we've had during the period in peacetime from 1976 or 7 to 1981, much less. And the post-war inflation, which came afterwards, while it was not necessary and was due to some mistakes that were made, that post-war inflation actually was less than we have had in almost in 1 year of the inflationary period during the last 5 or 6 years.
There was some discussion with Mr. Buckley about the failure of the president to do as much as I was hearing you, Mr. Buckley, suggest he should have done for blacks. But wasn't it true that in the South in those days, Mr. Prichard, a lot of blacks couldn't vote? Constitutionally, they may have been able to, obviously, but the reality was they weren't voting. And so the pitch was to the Southern Bourbons and the courthouse Democrats who control the Southern vote. But isn't the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which was enacted by Lyndon Johnson, who called Roosevelt said Roosevelt was like a daddy to me, another Southerner, if a Texan can be classified as a Southerner, wasn't that Civil Rights Act in some ways part of the legacy of the New Deal, Mr. Prichard?
I would like to think so. I'm not sure that Mr. Buckley would agree with that, but I would like to think it was. You know, I felt about that the way I felt when I was a member of the platform committee at the Democratic Convention in 1948 when Mr. Truman was president. We were sitting there debating a civil rights platform, and the people who wanted to go slow offered as a plank the same plank that had been in the 1944 platform when Roosevelt was running.
Causing the Humphrey walkout.
The Humphrey walkout was in 8. It was the anti-Humphrey walkout in 48. It was when Strom Thurmond walked out. Humphrey led the fight for it. But anyway, the question was in the platform committee, and there was a gentleman from Ohio who was on the platform committee. I can see him now. He had his glasses on a ribbon, a long ribbon, and those glasses, and he wanted the moderate plank.
30 seconds.
He said, what's good enough for Franklin D. Roosevelt is good enough for me, and my reply was, what was good enough for Franklin Roosevelt isn't good enough for Franklin Roosevelt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Al Smith. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Mr. Prichard.
Well, thank you, Mr. Buckley.
Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and other public television stations, the Mobile Corporation, John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, Laurel Foundation, Sunstrand Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line. This program was produced by SECA, which is solely responsible for its content. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $2 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. Indicate the subject of the program and please allow 3 weeks for delivery.